When the Night Comes Out presents The Hive, Part 11. The count was bad. Everything was bad. Of the 1,535 prisoners in the Hive, there were only 600 left. Of the 800 guards, there were just 320 left. There were 1,000 administrative staff, medical staff, and others in the administration building. There had been just over 200 total on the medical staff. There were only 25 nurses left, and those were the ones who had not been on duty the night before. Of the rest of the 1,000 administrative staff, there they had caught a break. There were still 700 left. A grand total of just over 1,600 people left. So many dead, and far too many who had been turned into one of those things. Kettinger looked at the handwritten totals on a piece of notebook paper. Jenny had handed it to him with shaking fingers just a few moments before. His assistant's fingers were caked with drying blood, and her face was streaked with it. Kettinger had seen her with a rifle, firing away in the opened cargo area before the doors had closed, a sight he never thought he would ever have to see. Now her eyes were wide and glassy, and she appeared to be staring at something off at a great distance that Kettinger could not see. "Jesus," Kettinger said, looking at the numbers. He handed it to Dalton King, who stood next to him. "That means that there are 1,600 people that have been turned into one of those things, or are dead." Jenny let out a soft moan. Kettinger looked at her and reached out his hand and placed it gently on her shoulder. "Jenny," he said quietly, "go down and see if you can get some sleep. See one of the nurses if you can, and get something to help you sleep." "I don't know if I'll be able to sleep ever again," Jenny whispered, but then she turned and walked slowly and dreamlike out of the office. Kettinger turned around and faced the large window behind his desk. The Hive had always been an impressive view. Now, it provided nothing but terror. He looked down and saw the thousands of things that had once been people standing there in the corridors among the cells. All of them were packed tight, like sardines in a can, shoulder to shoulder, not moving. Their eyes were turned up, as if glaring at the window out which Kettinger currently looked. They had been that way for a while now. They were not trying to pound on doors. They had not crawled up the side of the administration building. All of the windows and doors that led outside into the Hive had been covered with metal panels. The one saving grace were the thick windows that were part of Kettinger's office. "Just look at them," Dalton King said. He had not said much since they had arrived inside the building. It was likely the reality of seeing the creatures that Kettinger had described in the flesh. Everyone was quiet. They're just standing there, like they're thinking about something. Kettinger looked down at the vile, blood-smeared, rotting faces, many of them with their sharp teeth exposed. They are. If they're really a hive mind, then they're probably sitting there thinking about what to do next. "We have to figure out something to do about them, and fast," King said. "It won't be long before they decide to go after Hive City. They'll figure out that they can't get in here and try their luck with the gate." "I don't think they can get through the gate," Kettinger said, trying to sound confident, but already worried. "Carl will hold them." King turned his head and then cocked it to the side as if studying Kettinger to see if he was telling the truth. "Do you really think so? One man holding off thousands? All of your guards combined could barely accomplish that. They'll find a way to crawl right over him and into the houses that are out there. Although you made the announcement, I don't think that many in Hive City got into this building. Is there a place where they can go in Hive City?" Kettinger felt a sinking in his stomach. He went over to his desk, grabbed the phone, punched in some numbers, and waited. A moment later, someone picked up at the other end. "Carol?" Kettinger said. "Yes, we're locked down in here. I need you to get the people who were left in Hive City into the school. Then do the lockdown there. Do it fast." Kettinger slammed the phone down and looked at King. "Is the school as secure as this building?" King asked. Probably not, Kettinger said, almost in a whisper, talking to the desk. It's not built right into the stone wall like this place. However, Q and most of the others don't know about it being able to lock down, and that might help. They didn't know about this here? King said, waving his hand to indicate the administration building. No, Kettinger said. Just me and whoever else ends up as warden. This was to be a last-ditch thing that could only be triggered by one person. What if you had been killed, or turned into one of them? King asked. Kettinger raised his eyes and stared back. He didn't know what to say. If he had been killed or been turned, that would have been the end. What do you think they want? Kettinger asked at last. They want to get out, King said, turning his head back around to stare at them. They want to get to the surface. They'll take as many of us as they can, use the rest for food, and try to get to the surface. What will happen if they get up there? I don't think the world will stand a chance, King said. They turn someone with a single bite, and it happens so fast. If it's true that the knowledge of each person they turn gets added to their hive mind, then imagine if they start turning policemen, politicians, terrorists, and military men. These are not the mindless, shambling zombies from the movies that we usually think about. These are something else. But they are reanimated dead tissue, Kettinger said, standing beside Dalton King. Yes, they appear to be. As I mentioned, this may be where the legends of zombies came from. However, I think these are probably closer to demons. There are many stories of demons being able to take over bodies of the innocent with a mere touch. These demons take over, killing the host, absorbing their minds into the hive mind, and then turning them into killing machines. But look at them. King pointed to the mass of bodies. They rot quite fast, King said. The energies involved must burn out the bodies. I don't know if that means that sitting here and waiting them out will cause them all to die, or if we'll just end up with 1,000 toothy, vicious, demonically animated skeletons. I have no desire to find out, Kettinger said. The question is, what do we do next? Dalton King turned away from the sight outside the window and faced Kettinger. You could start by telling me why you wanted me here, he asked. I mean, I know that having my brain as part of the hive mind is not ideal, but that could have been solved in ways we've already discussed. Why bring me here? Kettinger sighed and stood up. He walked across the office and stared at the banks of monitors along the wall. Most of them were blank, especially the ones in the hospital area. The other monitors showed empty hallways. Well, you are the biggest mass murderer that happens to be incarcerated in the hive, Kettinger said, slowly turning back around to face King. I don't mean to put too fine a point on it, but it's very true. You know how to wipe out a lot of these things in one shot. I was hoping you might have some idea how we could wipe these fuckers out in one shot. King nodded and then let out a laugh. He turned back around until he could stare down at the ghouls that were still there in a tight pack outside the administration building. I will do my best to forget the semantics, Michael, King said. We shouldn't get into one of our long political discussions about whether or not I am a freedom fighter or a terrorist or a murderer. The fact is, technically, you are correct. I know how to make bombs and other weapons of mass destruction, but there is one very fine point that we do need to put on our discussions. Dalton King sighed and shook his head. These creatures are already dead, King continued. We know that they can be taken down permanently if we hit them in the head, but that's a hard bomb to make. Yes, let me get access to all of your weapons and construct a bomb that will only hit those intended targets in the head. I don't think such a thing can be done. I understand that, Kettinger replied. However, even if they are already dead, if you chop them into pieces, they'd be disabled. If we blow them to pieces, the pieces don't seem to bring themselves back together to form a whole again. So the right bomb will blow them to pieces. Perhaps it would cause so much damage to each of them that whatever demonic entity is inside them will leave or die off. King gave a nod. I can appreciate that line of thinking. Okay, so we're thinking that a massive explosive or powerful weapons are the way to go. Fine. I can do that, provided I have the right tools. However, I am willing to bet that there is one thing that is going to be a considerable problem. What? I'm betting that most of the powerful explosives, or the equipment I need to make them, King said, and then he gestured out the window dramatically, are located over in the mines there. Kettinger followed the pointing finger, even though he knew exactly what he was pointing at and what he was saying. He felt a sinking feeling in his gut. And, Kettinger said, we'd have to get through all of them to get there. Dalton King nodded. Kettinger walked back over to the window and leaned against his desk. He stared down at the thousands of ghouls, all of them with their teeth, rotting flesh, tearing hands, and mindless methods of attacking. They had already lost so many, but how many would they lose trying to get back to the mines? Okay then, Kettinger said. Then we have to come up with another solution. What do we have here inside the building that we can use to cut through them and then build a bomb to wipe what's left of them off the map? King laughed and rubbed his hands over his face. Well, if we have weapons powerful enough to protect us and get through that swarm, then we don't really need the bombs, do we? Maybe there's another way to get there. Kettinger shrugged. Think about it, Michael. King said, as if Kettinger were a student in a classroom, and not a particularly bright one. We use what they used against us, against them. Think. It dawned on Kettinger slowly. He stood up from the desk and peered down into one of the ghoul's eyes. The eyes stared back, dead inside, but somehow burning with hatred and hunger. We'll need to see blueprints of this place, Kettinger said, and then he stared at Dalton King. Not sure it's a good idea to let you see those. Do we really have time to worry about such things right now? No. However, I'm not sure we can access the airshaft system from the building here, Kettinger said. This building was designed so that it could be shut off from the prison, like it is now. That means we have a separate air circulation system. Plus, we did weld a few metal pieces into the air vents to try and stop them. I want to pinpoint those spots, in case we have to work around them. King put a hand to his chin. I see. Well, that does complicate things. However, we only have to get as far as the first cell, or one of the closest cells. What about one of the lower levels? Could we break through a wall and into a cell, and then into the airshaft system? Maybe. Just maybe. Kettinger replied. We're gonna have to find the blueprints ourselves. Normally, I'd ask Jenny, but she's down with the prisoners and tending to the injured. Are they online? No, the idea was that having them in paper form would prevent them from being hacked, Kettinger said. Come on. Minutes later, they were in a basement room filled with filing cabinets. Kettinger spent several minutes refamiliarizing himself with the entire system down there. Once he remembered how everything was filed, he found the blueprints right away. In 20 minutes, he had them spread across a table. Dalton King leaned in close, while Kettinger stood beside him. It was clear that King had spent lots of time with blueprints before. Were you an architect? Kettinger asked. Well, sort of. King replied with a devilish smile. I mean, I studied it, but that was only to benefit my final plan. You can bring down the tallest building with minimal effort if you know where to look and how to look at it. King bent low over the prints and began flipping through the fragile pages. One after another he cast aside until he came to one that caused him to stop and press both hands against the table. To Kettinger, it looked like a mass of blue lines, like veins. This is it, King said. What? The first cell can be accessed right through one of the walls in the administration building, King said. Once we get in there, we should be able to get down to the shafts and find what we need. We have to move fast, but we can get to the explosives and materials I can use to make a bomb back at the shaft using this. Kettinger marked a few places. These are the places where we welded some metal plates. I think the ghouls broke through them, but I can't be certain. King pointed to one particular blue vein and traced it across the page. Kettinger followed, trying to place where the blue vein was in relation to the cells. From what he could remember, it went from a spot not far from the administration building to one of the cells closest to the mining operation. It would then be a short hop from the cell into the mines and the equipment there. In fact, the final cell was not far from where King's original cell had been. I think if we take that route, we can avoid the welded areas, King said. They'll be in the shafts too, Kettinger said. King nodded. We'll have to try and block them off. You started doing that before. We'll need to keep doing that. I think the shafts will be a one-way deal. I don't think we'll be able to get back here using them, if we can get back here at all. And that's something you have to be prepared for, you know. This may be a one-way trip for anyone stupid enough to volunteer. Kettinger had thought about that. Yeah, but I think that may be a small price to pay to prevent them from getting to the surface. An odd smile crossed King's face. What are you smiling about? Kettinger asked. Just thinking that this whole situation is funny, King replied, shaking his head. There was a time when this kind of thing was what I would be looking to unleash upon the world. Now that I see how it works, however, I worry that there won't be a world left to rule over if this kind of thing gets out. Just struck me as odd how life turns out. Kettinger let himself smile and let out a small laugh. It felt good and eased just a small amount of tension. Okay, so what do you think? Kettinger asked. The ventilation system of this building is cut off from the rest of the hive. We did that to make this safe and separate from the hive. Since we release gas and such in the cells, we didn't want that coming back into the admin building. That means that the shaft you're pointing at is only accessible outside this building, and that means running straight into a giant pack of undead tooth monsters. Not necessarily, Michael, King said, pointing at the blueprint. You can get into the shaft via this cell here. That cell adjoins the outer wall of the admin building, I believe. That means we can probably break through into that cell from within this building. Once we get in there, the door to the cell will be locked, and we can get into the ventilation system. Kettinger stared at the spot on the blueprint. His internal maps brought everything that King was saying into focus. He was right. We have hammers in here, but we have to find a way to bring down a wall without creating so much noise that those things hear it and figure out what we're doing, Kettinger said. Well then, let's get the tools and some volunteers, King replied. We can think about how to demolish walls silently while we do that. It took about 3 hours to get through. However, the first part took almost 45 minutes for everyone to find the old tool shed buried in the lower regions of the administration building. The tools had long ago been moved, for the most part, after the building had been constructed. The hammers were old and rusty. As for volunteers, they found more than they needed. No one wanted to sit around and watch out of windows as people that were friends and were now dead stood mutely. It was only a matter of time before the hive mind would come up with some plan of attack. Trying to get a wall down was easier to deal with than that. Now, how do we do this without alerting them? Kettinger said when he and King returned to his office to look down on the gathering crowd of ghouls. They were still there, still standing, swaying slightly as if in a breeze. Do you have a sound system in here? King said, looking around the office. What? Do you have a sound system? King repeated. Speakers? A way to play the radio station? Why? King looked exasperated. Don't be thick. We can point the speakers out the window and blast the loudest fucking music we can find. Put a call into the radio station and tell them to play the loudest shit they can find. Given the height and general structure of the hive, it should travel quite nicely and be very loud out there. How do we get the speakers out the window? Cut them, break the glass, whatever you need to do. Kettinger had no response to that. 10 minutes later, 6 prisoners, Reg, and 2 other guards were removing speakers from within the walls of Kettinger's office. They then cut holes in the thick glass using laser cutters that Kettinger hadn't even been aware were stored in the tool closet. They cut them very specifically so that the speakers would just fit. Then they sealed the edges around the speakers with some kind of bonding material that Reg dug up. Play whatever you can that's loud, Kettinger said over the phone to the radio station in Hive City. The louder and more obnoxious, the better. Got it. A moment later, the sound emanating from the speakers shook the room. The bass from the music was so intense that Kettinger thought the glass would shatter. There were squealing and shrieking guitars and pounding drums. The singer, if you could call him that, was screaming unintelligible words into the mic. "Jesus," King whispered. "Yeah, our DJ has some interesting musical tastes," Kettinger shouted. Outside, the ghouls all turned their heads in unison. They stared up at the windows and the speakers with their shrieking noise. Slowly, each of them bared their pointed teeth. "We've got their attention, Michael," King said directly into Kettinger's ear. "We'd best get moving." Kettinger gave a nod. "Post guards up here. I want someone here with weapons at all times, and that music is not to stop. I don't know how those things would get up here, but they might try to attack, and those holes in the windows are now weak spots. Make sure nothing gets through." The guards that had been there to help with the installation nodded. Kettinger and King turned and left the room, Kettinger certain that his men would do as he had asked. Kettinger and King ran through the halls and were at the elevators in seconds. The guards and Reg fell in step behind them. They shot down to the lower levels and ran through a maze of halls that Kettinger had never seen before to find the room that would lead into the cell beyond the wall. It was a storage closet, and it was filled with boxes of office supplies. They set about removing those boxes, setting them up in the hallway. Once they had done that, they faced off against a stone wall. "That looks rather intimidating," King said. "Let's get started. Who has the jackhammer?" Two guards stepped forward. They looked awkward and unsure of themselves. "Do we have any minors down here?" King asked. Two prisoners stepped forward from behind the row of boxes. "Give them the jackhammers," King said. The guards handed the jackhammers over to the two men. Seconds later, the room was filled with dust and deafening noise. The wall began to crumble, but slowly. The jackhammers were ungodly loud, and Kettinger found himself putting his hands to his ears. Outside, the ghouls stared intently at the shrieking music and the speakers in the windows. They swayed gently, almost in time with the beat of the music. Then, about a dozen of them peeled off, away from the main pack, and walked slowly toward the administration building. Their teeth were bared, their clawed hands were bent at the knuckles, and they gazed at the windows intently, unwavering. They stood together, as if thinking, at the base of the building for several seconds. Then two of them dug their claws into the stone wall and began to climb. Then four of them. Then six of them. Then a dozen of them were climbing the building like spiders. Down in the basement, the wall crumbled down. They could already see into the cell beyond the wall. It was a small hole, maybe about the size of someone's head, but it was a start. The wall was thick, that was for sure. "We'll be through faster than I thought," King shouted to Kettinger. "Yeah, but I wonder if the music is blocking this racket," Kettinger replied. "I don't want to step away and find out." In Kettinger's office above, the guards stepped to the window and looked down. The ghouls were climbing rapidly, their clawed fingers digging into the stone, their feet pushing them forward and upward. In less than 5 minutes, they were at the windows. The guards held up their weapons and stepped away from the windows. The faces of the ghouls had rotted. Their teeth seemed longer, as if they had grown more teeth as their flesh rotted away. One of them was a guard, and both of the guards knew the man, had known the man. One of them was a woman, a former nurse, and her bloody and torn scrubs, and her face nearly half-eaten away. Each of them was a horror, all teeth and gray, rotted flesh. Many of them bore horrific wounds that made them look like shark attack victims. The music continued. It was a new song now, but the bass and shrieking lyrics were just as loud. The climbing creatures had paused to stare into the windows. Their eyes looked dead and black. Some of them had white films over their eyes. They stared into the office beyond, but if they had any recognition for the guards there, they did not show it. Down in the basement, a huge chunk of the wall fell down into dust and rubble. Now the hole looked big enough for them to crawl through. King stepped forward and told them to stop with the hammers. Then he studied the hole. It was a short crawl, but it would be tight. Fortunately, no one used to living this far underground was claustrophobic. Without a word, King was the first to climb through. Reg went next. Then Kettinger followed. The other guards and prisoners came next. There were 10 of them in total. Kettinger's communicator buzzed against his hip. He put the earpiece into his right ear. What? It was Jenny. They've climbed the admin building. There are about 10 of them, and they're right outside the window where the speakers are. Okay, stay calm, Kettinger said. If they break through, the guards will take them down, but get a crew up there to seal up those windows. We're through the wall already, so we don't need the music. Okay, Jennifer said and signed off, but Kettinger could tell that she was scared. He could only imagine what she was seeing. We have to move, Kettinger said. We need to get this done fast. They're outside the window of the office. I don't think it'll be too long before they break through. King just shrugged and looked up at the vent located in the corner of the cell. It was cramped in the tiny room. All of them were breathing hard. King stood up on the bed and reached up to the vent. Then he turned and looked back behind him. Anyone got a screwdriver? He asked. There was a tense moment when everyone looked around, and it seemed like no one had a screwdriver. Kettinger would have laughed had it not been so tragic that their adventure would end before it could begin due to a lack of a screwdriver. Then one of the guards produced a pocket knife that had a screwdriver in it, and Kettinger felt relief. King got back up on the bed and soon made quick work of the screws holding the vent cover in place. Kettinger noted how fast he removed them and thought that if he ever managed to get out of this without turning into a ghoul or being devoured, they might want to improve the structure of the cells, including the screws holding the air vent in place. They all stared at the open vent. I guess I can go first, King said. But please, I have no desire to be doing this alone, so please follow after me. He gave a cockeyed smile and then hoisted himself up. He got his head and shoulders through the vent, and then his legs dangled for a moment, and then they vanished too. Kettinger hoisted himself up next. He had a moment of sheer panic at what he was doing when the darkness of the vent enveloped him. Then he wriggled all the way inside. He reached down and found the headlamp he had grabbed on his way out and put it on his head. He clicked on the light, and he could see King's shoes up ahead of him. Kettinger wriggled forward, breathing steadily, trying to hold himself together. Onward, he whispered and wriggled forward. The 2 guards stood there as the ghouls stared into the office. Both of them shifted from one foot to the next, their hands on the triggers. What should we do? Asked one. We wait, said the other. Don't shoot them unless they break in. The first one swallowed, and his throat clicked. He felt his forehead break out in a sweat, and he wiped his hand across it. He had come so close to being chomped in their mad run to the administration building. His heart was pounding in his chest, and he felt close to running. The terrible creature, a former guard, clung to the edge of the administration building and slowly extended one hand toward the speaker that was still sending out ungodly noises. The hand found the edge of the speaker. The ghoul's muscles flexed. He's trying to pull that fucking thing out of the window, said the guard on the right. Is that Johnny? Yeah, well, it was. Jesus Christ, this is a fucking nightmare. You've got that right. Then another of the ghouls scrabbled across the window like a spider. How it was clinging to the smooth glass, they could never guess, but it was. This one also extended a hand and placed it on the speaker and began to pull. Then another one came up the outer wall and then across the glass. Then another, all of them pulling on the speakers. There was nothing for a while, just the breathing of the 2 guards and the pounding bass from the music. Then silently, a crack appeared in the window. Then the sound of the glass giving way filled the interior office. Shit. You got that right. The 2 guards hefted their rifles. The speaker on the left gave way first. With a rending, screeching tear and cracking and breaking glass, it fell outward and tumbled into the hive. Then the speaker on the right did the same thing. The guard on the left fired first, and the guard formerly known as Johnny's head exploded. The guard on the right fired, and the former nurse's chest erupted in blood, but she clung to the window. Then he fired again, and her head burst apart like a ripe melon. She fell backward into the void. Outside, the ghouls opened their mouths and let out a horrendous unified screech. The music had been silenced when the speakers fell, and the wires had disconnected. They all moved as one, hundreds of them, advancing toward the building, and they began to climb like a swarm of ants up the stone side of the building. They moved in a strange, coordinated manner, as if it were a dance. The guards in the office aimed and fired. One by one they fell as they tried to climb through the holes left by the speakers. However, it was obvious that there were more of them than they had bullets, and the two began to slowly move backwards toward the door of the office. Outside that door were men with a large piece of metal to weld over the door. The walls of Kettinger's office had been reinforced to make it a kind of safe room should there have been any kind of prisoner riot, so the office would soon become a prison for anyone or anything that broke in. "Just get out of there," someone yelled from behind. "Get out while we can still weld the door shut." Both guards fired 2 more times and then turned to run. They still had about 10 feet from where they were to where the doorway was. Behind them, there was a sickening cracking and shattering sound, and then the horrendous shriek that the ghouls made filled the air. The first guard managed to make it to the door and leap through. The second, however, stumbled as he ran, his foot catching on a leather chair leg. His gun flew from his hand and clattered against the wall. His chin hit the thick carpet, and he saw stars. "No!" he yelled as hands grabbed his legs and he began to slide backwards. "No!" The office door slammed shut, and the sounds of the guards screaming seemed to last a very long time to those stuck on the other side. They crawled and crawled and crawled. At some point, Kettinger was able to close his eyes and just inch along without having to open them. Despite the headlamp on his forehead, it was so dark inside the air shaft that he could barely see King's souls ahead of him. He was breathing hard. His arms and legs hurt from exercise that he had not given them for years. "Mike!" Kettinger jumped. The voice was urgent and afraid and loud in his ear. He realized that he had not removed the earpiece before climbing in. "Yeah, Jen," he said. "They got into the office." Kettinger felt an ice-cold fist close around his heart. "Did you contain them?" "We have the office sealed up," Jennifer replied. "You know how that office is designed to work. We put the metal seals over the door and have the office in lockdown. Ben, one of the guards, didn't make it out, though. Jackson did, but not Ben." There was a hiccup in her voice. "It was awful," she finished. "Okay," he replied. That might have been the first person she actually saw get devoured. For Kettinger, it was just the latest horror in a day so full of them that he could not remember them at all. "We're on the move. Keep me posted, and make sure there are guards ready at the door. Remember that Q is part of them now. They have access to his memories. I don't remember off the top of my head how much he knows about the security systems." "Roger," Jennifer replied, and then she was gone. "Sorry." Kettinger tilted his head up and looked up at the bottom of Dalton King's shoes. "Pardon?" "I said I was sorry," King repeated. "That you lost another of your guards. For you, I am sure, being all so close, it's like losing a family member. On a more practical matter, every guard that either ends up devoured or in their ranks is more inside knowledge about the Hive that ends up in their collective. That makes things dangerous. In fact, it pretty much makes this little mission doubly dangerous. Did he know what the plan was?" That icy hand on Kettinger's heart squeezed harder. For a moment, he felt like he was going to pass out. "Michael?" "Yes," Kettinger replied. "Yes, they knew. Damn it, we have to move faster." "I agree," King said. "We have to be well past the place where the ghouls are gathered. I say we climb out into one of the cells and just make a run for it down the halls. We'll be able to go much faster." "Let's do it," Kettinger replied, and then he called the new plan down the line of people behind him. They stopped at the next vent, which led into an empty cell. With 2 kicks, King caved the vent into the room, where it clattered on the floor. Then he was through in seconds, dropping to the floor. Kettinger followed a moment later. When they were all gathered in the cell, Kettinger told them what had happened back at the building and that their entire mission was in danger. They had to run. The silence was deafening, but all of them nodded. A second later, the door was open, and now the silence inside the hive, which always buzzed with some kind of noise, even when things are supposed to be locked down, was just eerie. They ran. The ghouls meandered around the office. In front of them, the bitten and partially devoured guard was still motionless. He would awaken soon, changed, and now part of their collective mind. The thoughts of the hundreds of them buzzed through their minds. They wandered the office, touching things. Things that still bore some kind of familiarity despite their change. However, the things that they touched bore no sense of emotion. They had no emotion. They were one thought. They were one action. They had to get out. They had to get to the surface. They needed the one called Dalton King added to their ranks. They needed the one called Mike Kettinger. The guard twitched. Then his eyes opened, opening to a new world and a new way of thinking. His thoughts and memories were downloaded to the collective mind. For a moment, they all froze where they were, the ones inside the office and the ones outside. Then, the thoughts and knowledge of their new member entered their minds like a virus downloaded to a computer. Kettinger, King, guards, explosives, vents. They opened their mouths and let out a screech, including their newest member. They had to stop them. The ghouls in the office bolted for the holes in the window and hurled themselves out. They clung, upside down, scrambling down the outside of the administration building. They moved fast, and then reached the ground. They paused for a moment, and then they moved as one. They had to get back toward the mines. Their home. They must be stopped. You've been listening to When the Night Comes Out, The Hive. Tune in next time for The Hive, Part 12. Written by Brian W. Alaspa. Narrated and produced by Ali James. Music by Vivek Abhishek. Catch up on the first 4 seasons of When the Night Comes Out now. Support us on Patreon for more terrifying content.